Thank you for joining us on Yom HaShoah. I'm with Dr. Martin Stern, who received an MBE for Holocaust education and for work with the Memorial Day Trust. Today is a day where we commemorate victims and heroism. But as we reflect on the Shoah, we also reflect on not just the perpetrators and the victims, but also those who were righteous and those who stood by. It's so very easy to create a binary world of good and evil, but for people who have lived through the most terrible of circumstances, and many of us here will have experienced conversations with family members about the trials and the difficult circumstances they experienced. Some of the ethical challenges and the problems are ones which do not easily go away. And Martin's story is one which touches on some of the most beautiful and some of the most horrible people. And so it's a pleasure to welcome him to share with us his story this morning. And Martin, perhaps you could tell us just a little bit about your background and where you were born and how you entered into the terrible world of Shoah.
Let me just start with a comment. I mean, there's a comedy writer who used to be very famous. I've got a mental block for his name, but he wrote travel books. And in his book about Italy, he wrote that there comes a time when the visitor to Florence decides he would like to see just another 100 Madonnas and Child and then no more. And the thought passed through my mind because, of course, there are a lot of survivor stories being broadcast at the moment and presented to shuls. And the thought may have passed through some people's minds, why should we hear another survivor story, particularly when, by definition, that survivor story is completely untypical. If my story was not wildly untypical, you wouldn't be listening to me. I'd be dead. Even the image of Auschwitz and the images of Belsen are in a way misrepresentations, because most Jews who were murdered were just marched into the forest or up to the edge of a pit or something like that and shot. So the reason for telling this story, it is untypical, I accept that. Nevertheless, there are lessons in it, and you've alluded to that in your excellent introduction. At the age of 5, I was a school kid in Amsterdam. I was at a little school, and the form teacher had taken my class into the little school hall. It was a converted house. It was not very large. And she had told us to line up against the side wall as she was sitting behind a table on the little stage. And 2 young men walked in through the back door of the hall and said, "Is Martin Stern here?" And the teacher said, "No, he hasn't come in today." But aged 5, I didn't understand what was going on. I put my hand up and I was arrested and led out of that hall. And as I was led out, I looked around, and I'll never forget the ashen face of the teacher. So that's how I normally start the story, because I think it already brings out the points that you introduced the story with.
So you were born in Berlin?
No.
Sorry, your parents were from Berlin.
My parents were from
Berlin.
Yeah.
And came from proud Germanic families, yes?
Well, I'm not very well informed about my family's history prior to my grandparents, but it seems the family had not, had come from Poland within living memory.
Right.
Quite poor. My grandfather jointly owned with someone a business that made ladies' coats and dresses. It was very successful. They sold these in the fashionable center of Berlin and all over Europe, and they lived in a beautiful architect-designed villa on the outskirts of Berlin in Nikolassee, the opposite side of the Wannsee from the infamous Wannsee Villa, as a matter of fact. And they were very assimilated Jews. I guess they observed the main festivals in the most sort of bare bones way. Again, I don't have detailed information about that. That's my reconstruction from my aunt, my father's sister. They were very well versed in German culture. Their oldest son had fought in the German army in the First World War, my father's much older brother. They gave him the name Wilhelm, which I guess is not a typical Jewish name. And in First World War, Germany would have quite different connotations. So they, and at Christmas time, they had a Christmas tree because everybody else had one, and it was so nice for the children. And I'm sure you know the lifestyle that I'm alluding to.
Right.
And my father grew up as of course, perfectly aware that he was a Jew, and no doubt proud of being Jewish, but at the same time a proud atheist and communist. He and I think a classmate of his in the architecture college fell in love. She was not Jewish. She was a non-Jewish German girl who opted in 1938 to marry a Jew. She had to leave the country of her birth in order to do that. But my father married out.
And that's what took your parents to Holland?
Indeed. Of course, the Nuremberg laws made a relationship life-threatening. They fled to the Netherlands, where the Dutch, who had not yet been invaded, this neutral, peace-loving, tolerant country, applied Nazi law to people who had fled the Nazis. And my parents were refused permission to marry in the Netherlands. My non-Jewish mother went to Brussels to live there long enough to qualify under Belgian law to have a wedding in Belgium. And my father and two friends went to Brussels, where my parents married. They went back to the Netherlands, where I was born. Mm-hmm. The Nazis, of course, didn't care whether the Dutch thought they were neutral. They invaded. Anti-Nazi laws very quickly started to be introduced. The Nazis, of course, had all these laws already. They had them in Germany, in Austria, and in Poland, and in what had been Czechoslovakia. They could simply have filled boxes with these laws in Germany, taken them across the border and translated them into Dutch, not the world's hardest task. But they didn't do that. They introduced these laws one by one by one. Salami tactics.
Right.
Because they had practical experience of corralling Jews into a trap. And they had, it is completely wrong to think of the Nazis as being mindless thugs. They were not mindless. They were people, they included professors and a lot of people with PhDs in subjects like law and medicine. They were not lacking in intelligence or education. They just misused those characteristics.
Right.
And yeah, so these more than 2,000 laws in the Nazi Empire were gradually infiltrated into the Netherlands.
So what particular memories do you have of your father as a child from your childhood?
Well, funnily enough, my earliest memory must have been from when I was 2, because I can remember sitting on the handlebars of his bike as he was wheeling it across a sandy scrubland, which must have been in Hilversum, a town not terribly far from Amsterdam. And there's some scenes from Hilversum are still in my mind. But we then moved to Amsterdam, to a first floor flat overlooking a beautiful park. If anybody knows Amsterdam, it's the Vondelpark. And there I had my 3rd birthday. At a particular point, my father could no longer earn his living as an architect, and he started making wooden toys. And I wasn't allowed to play with these beautiful toys that he'd made with the paint and varnish drying on the window ledge. And it took my parents quite some time to convince me I shouldn't touch them, so that they could be sold in pristine condition. And then my dad disappeared, and no matter how much I asked, my mum wouldn't tell me where he was.
What did happen to him?
He was hidden by on a farm very close to Amsterdam airport, which of course has expanded out of recognition since those days. But even then, you could hop on your bike and, within a few minutes, you'd be at the edge of the airport. What remains of the farm is now just under the end of the takeoff runway. So if you've ever taken off from Amsterdam, you've flown a few hundred feet above what remains of that farm. Part of it was destroyed by the Nazis, and the rest is now a private house. And they're a Protestant family, the Bogaert family. The man was called Hannes Bogaert, a devout Protestant. People with primary school education only. During the week, you'd see them with their blue overalls and clogs, looking after their tiny little farm. Hid at any one time up to 70 Jews. The farm was raided 3 times. He was warned if he did it again, he would be for it. And he said, if I want to do it again, I will do it again. He did. During the 2nd raid, his son was interrogated in an outbuilding and came out without his teeth, which he had lost during the interrogation, but he had not divulged where the Jews were. At one of the raids, it must have been the 3rd one, 2 Nazi officers came to arrest Hannes Bogaert, and whilst they were eating their evening meal, and he said, sit down, we haven't finished. And it was their custom to read from the Bible after a meal. And Hannes Bogaert got up, picked up the Bible, opened it at a page, and unfortunately we don't know what the passage was, but he read out a passage that had particular relevance to these 2 so-and-sos who were waiting there to take him away. And he read that out and then closed the Bible and said, now you can take me. And he and his son both died in concentration camps.
And your father?
My father had been sent to another farm. That was the normal practice. The first one was really a reception center, and people were then distributed to other hiding places. That farm was raided by the Nazis. As soldiers jumped off the back of a lorry, my father ran into a field with a pistol, and during the pursuit shot 2 of his pursuers. And according to one of the 2 versions I have, he shot them dead. He was caught. The normal procedure for people caught with any suspicion of being involved in the Dutch resistance, which my father was, and the farmer who was hiding him was, that's why he had a weapon. The normal procedure was the interrogation started with a beating up and then got worse. Torture was quite routine. The Dutch changed the name of the street where this was done because it sent shivers down their spine after the war. So he went through that center. Of course, I have no information about what actually happened to him. He was sent to Auschwitz. He didn't die there. He reappeared in Buchenwald, so he will have been, I guess, on a death march or in an open coal truck in the middle of a severe winter in single-layer Auschwitz clothing, starved. I mean, a horrific process, even if you went by train, or a combination of the two. And he is recorded as having died in Buchenwald, 5 kilometers outside the beautiful cultural town of Weimar. The Weimar Republic is called the Weimar Republic because it's a nice place to hold a conference. That's where they agreed the Weimar Constitution. It's not where the government was.
Right.
Associated with Goethe, Schiller, and the Bauhaus, which was important to my father. And 5 kilometers outside, there is a hill, the Ettersberg, with a beech forest. The beech forest in German is a Buchenwald. And there, in that horrific concentration camp that the Nazis used slaves to build, my father is recorded as having died on the 25th of March, 1945. Of course, an example of the fact that Jews did not go like sheep to the slaughter. The ones who resisted were usually killed on the spot and are not around afterwards to tell the tale. Yom HaShoah is, of course, set up to commemorate the date of the Warsaw Uprising. Sheep to the slaughter thing is a slander made by people who have not been in that situation of being confronted with Nazis with guns who would shoot you if you stepped out of line or showed the slightest sign of disobedience. Everybody, all of you will have seen film of Nazi, German prisoners of war in Russian hands marching towards captivity in the Soviet Union, also like sheep to the slaughter. These were young men trained in violence. They behaved no differently. So my father did resist. And that was a very important part of the reason why my sister and I survived in the end.
Right. So let's move on to onto your sister and the last time you saw your mother.
Well, in November 1942, I saw my dad for the last time. He came home. My parents were very agitated. What had happened? My mum had gone into labor. And my dad risked his life coming from his hiding place to help my mum get to the maternity hospital and to take me to an architect colleague and friend to be looked after for a few days whilst my mum was giving birth. He, being hidden on a farm that was involved in resistance, would have been better informed than the average Dutch citizen. There were Dutch people who hunted Jews. All it would have taken would have been for somebody in the street where we lived to spot him down below from the window of their flat, pick up the phone to the local Amsterdam Dutch police station and say, "I've just seen a Jew, Mr. Stern, in the street. Come quickly and you'll get him." And for that, the betrayer would have got the equivalent in our money today of 38 quid. You know, I did a shop recently in Sainsbury's and the bill came to 4 times that.
Wow.
For the life of a human being. He must have known that. So my sister Erica was born. Somebody in the hospital didn't wash their hands, a nurse or a doctor, and my mother got an infection of the womb, childbed fever. It was not uncommon in hospital births in those days. It is sadly not completely unknown even today. And it had been already demonstrated by a Hungarian doctor in Vienna that washing hands between patients would stop this disease from happening. But you know, but there were no antibiotics, and my mum died. So there was my sister with no mother, father not able to look after her because he was hiding to save his own life, and the couple who had taken me in for a few days, as they thought, well, they were stuck with me. And they looked after me for 2 years. Actually, 5 minutes walk from where Anne Frank was hidden. Of course, I didn't know that. I didn't know about Anne Frank until after the war, and that I've been so close to her until a couple of decades ago, I guess. And I actually timed the walk early last year. In totally different circumstances. It was a small flat. They had no hiding place, but they pretended I was their son.
Right, and that's how you came to be going to school.
And they sent me to the school, yes. And they took me out shopping. They took me to the zoo and to the circus. And, I mean, all the neighbors, one of whom was a member of the Dutch Nazi Party, they knew that. All the neighbors knew they'd suddenly acquired a 4-year-old son. And it didn't take a lot of guesswork to surmise why that might be.
Right, and that came to you being singled out at school.
Somehow the Nazis knew about me. Actually, I have a little card which shows that I had been registered. One of the first anti-Jewish laws passed was that Jews had to report to the local town hall and register as Jews. The Dutch post office helped the Nazis invent an ID card, which every adult had to carry. It had a photograph and a thumbprint visible from both sides of the card because the thumbprint was on a transparent paper window. And the card stock was a bit like a banknote. It was essentially unforgeable. The Dutch resistance, which included a lot of printers and a lot of people skilled in forgery, never really succeeded in forging those identity cards. At least not without stealing supplies of the cardstock, which they sometimes did. So the Jews now got a great big red letter J or a black letter J stamped in their ID card. And in the Dutch Resistance Museum, you can see ID cards where attempts have been made to remove that J, and it's blatantly obvious. That piece of Dutch collaboration helped, it cost huge numbers of lives. A copy of that information was kept in every town hall. And I, as a child, was registered in that way. Jews had to pay for the privilege. And the penalty for not complying, for not registering, was deportation in one of these cattle trucks. And whilst people didn't know exactly what happened, they knew enough. They knew it was life-threatening. So the Jews registered, and now the Nazis knew where all the Jews lived.
So you were identified at school and called out. What happened then?
I was interrogated at the school, which had been made the headquarters of the Sicherheitsdienst, the SD, the secret police arm of the SS, by a man speaking good Dutch. And I was then taken out and led down a corridor, a school corridor, doors off each side, all closed except for one door, which was open. And through that door, I could see into a smallish classroom. On the far wall was a map. And standing there, looking at that map with his back to me, was a man, one man. The man who with his wife, had been looking after me for 2 years. And I still didn't understand properly what was going on. And I called out to him. I wanted to run up to him and ask him what was happening. But I was dragged away. That's what they wanted. They wanted me, a 5-year-old, to betray the fact that I knew him so well that I could recognize him from behind when I was not expecting to see him there. So that he, under interrogation, couldn't deny that he and his wife had been harboring for 2 years the little son of a Jew.
Right. You know what happened to him?
Yes. He was sent to a horrific concentration camp in Germany itself, 20 kilometers from the center of Hamburg. On a bend in the river, there's a village. It's a beautiful village, cottages, weeping willows, a bend in the river, lovely in the sunset, and a few hundred yards away, the remains of a concentration camp, which bears the beautiful name of that village, Neuengamme, where people were starved, beaten, worked, and otherwise done to death. and his wife got just his spectacles back with a faked death certificate, which was routine, lying that he had died of natural causes.
And what happened to you?
I was put on a train with a bunch of women and taken to the prison camp, the transit camp in the Netherlands, Westerbork. So high barbed wire fence, wooden watchtowers, black creosoted wooden huts, bare sandy soil, and outside the barbed wire fence, flat heathland. First thing I remember being told is don't go near to that barbed wire fence. Those watchtowers, the soldiers in those watchtowers have guns. They will shoot you dead. I was herded into part of a hut partitioned off for little boys. The other boys were terrific. They helped me settle in this frightening, terrible place. The food was awful. It consisted of vegetables you would throw out, and not a lot of those. When I asked about meat and fish, people laughed at me. Now, I was told that my sister was also in that prison camp. I don't remember seeing her. I know now where she was, but I didn't know at the time. And so I lived there with those other boys who were wonderful. They became my friends. There was a guy there in Hasidic dress who started a little Hebrew class, and the first reading and writing, or the reading anyway, that I learned in my life was not the Roman alphabet, it was the Hebrew alphabet. And he had somehow got a blackboard on a stand and a little piece of chalk, and using a piece of chalk sideways, he drew a beautiful letter Aleph. And the two letters I could remember afterwards, and I didn't really realize, how one can interpret that until I learned more Hebrew later in my life, were the letter Aleph because of the beautiful way he drew it, and the letter Shin. And I remembered that letter because he described it as three little birds sitting on the twigs of a branch of a tree. It's such a beautiful description. But I didn't realize, of course, what word those letters spell.
You managed to weave in the beauty and mystery of parts of life at the same time as horror is unfolding around you. You and your sister then moved down to Theresienstadt.
Yes, I mean, first of all, those lessons didn't last long, but what a man. I mean, and those few lessons, he touched the rest of my life in a way that was completely unknowable to him. Anyway, yes, every week on Tuesdays, a train of goods trucks and cattle trucks would leave the camp, and I used to stand there watching these trains being loaded with my fellow prisoners, crammed in until they were packed like sardines, and then the doors closed and sealed with steel wire. And then as the train pulled out, there was a soldier with a rifle over his shoulder standing on a step on the end of each truck, holding onto a handle put there for the purpose. And even a stupid, ignorant 5-year-old could figure out what that soldier might do with his gun if one of the people inside escaped. And yes, my turn came, and I found myself cutting out a bit of the story. We were taken from Westerbork in a passenger train, but then quickly transferred to a cattle truck, and no room to sit. We were wedged standing against each other. There was a bucket for a toilet, no food or drink, and the journey in my memory always seemed to have taken 3 or 4 days and nights. In fact, people who have the records tell me it would have been 48 hours. But the same kind of journey as people had going to Auschwitz or Sobibor, which were the main destinations from the Netherlands. Towards the end of the journey, a man next to me died, and I was asking the adults around me why he was sleeping with his eyes open. I didn't understand, and they didn't explain. Some of those journeys took up to 5 days and nights, and then there would be piles of corpses coming out at the other end. My train, for a reason that is I don't really know, went to a different place. Same sort of journey, but different destination. The Nazis had a cunning plan to reinforce their lie that Jews were being resettled for forced labor by stealing a town from the Czechs. It was a walled garrison town, easy to turn into a prison. It still exists. It's Terezin, north of Prague. It has a German name, Theresienstadt. And by allowing a bit of heavily censored correspondence with the outside world, and later on allowing Potemkin village-like visits by the Red Cross, the Nazis used it for a great deception operation. But it was a disgustingly overcrowded place of horror. People were dying from starvation and from infection due to the filthy conditions and horrific overcrowding. And the main cause of death was being taken out by train to some killing center. On the first day, I was taken from amongst the boys I'd been put amongst. I had, I'm sorry to say, forgotten about my sister after that journey. A great source of shame to me, but, understandable. I was collected from there by a woman, a Dutch woman I didn't know, who took me to the shell of a shop that was her women's dormitory, and on the floor, sleeping places for women shoulder to shoulder. And at her sleeping place was my baby sister, who she'd collected from somewhere else. She had been told, when she said she wanted to look after some children, that there were 2 children coming from the Netherlands whose father had killed 2 German soldiers. Why didn't she take those 2? How that guy knew, I have no idea. She didn't know when I asked her after the war. But she looked after us for the rest of our time there. She worked in the kitchen. She stole food for us. She would have been killed if that had been reported to the SS. And somebody might have thought they were doing their good deed for the day, reporting it to the SS, because other people were dying from malnutrition. And she risked her life in other ways. When, in the end, it was announced children had to board the next train, and she correctly surmised that we would be going to our deaths. She could not keep us off the train. We were not hidden. We were in a women's dormitory. All those other women knew about both of us. And during the day when the women were doing slave labor, I was wandering around the town. I was not physically concealed. So she couldn't keep us off that train. But she decided that under those circumstances, she could not bear to put us on that train without coming with us. Incidentally, she was not Jewish. She was there. She was from a Catholic family in Amsterdam. She had married a Jewish market trader in Amsterdam. You know, they were not sophisticated people. They, again, primary school education only. But she did that, and our names were not called. You know, of all the children assembled to board that train, the 3 of us were left behind. Mrs. de Jong, the lady, my 2-year-old by now baby sister, and me. And we survived until the Nazis capitulated. Soviet soldiers passed through Theresienstadt, and eventually we were taken back to the Netherlands. A horrific journey back, and only to be stolen from this wonderful woman the day after we arrived in Amsterdam.
So where did you go?
My sister was taken by the family that had looked after her during the war, at risk to their lives. Highlighting the point you made at the beginning, that you can't classify people into either good or bad. People are both. I was sent to the woman who had lost her husband, whose husband was murdered in Neuengamme, for a few weeks, and then to the son of the family that had taken my sister in Amsterdam, where I lived after the war in the same square where Anne Frank had lived before she went into hiding, the Merwedeplein. I know it very well. I played there as a kid. Then eventually I joined my sister with the other family in a village near the city of Haarlem, not terribly far from Amsterdam.
Right. How did you come to London, or to England and Manchester?
Well, unexpectedly, eventually, the woman of that family with which I was now living died. And the husband, they were considered quite old for those days. I mean, they were a lot younger than I am now, but they were, conception of old age was different in the 1940s and 50s. And the man tried to look after us, but he couldn't cope. And we had family, my father's sister, so blood relatives, and my grandmother clamoring to have us in Manchester. At the same time, Wilhelm had in 1932 moved with his wife and two daughters to what was then Palestine. That is now a large and wonderful family, and they'd had a son there, and they were clamoring to have us as well. And I was asked 4 times whether I wanted to go to my family in Manchester or my family in Israel. And each time I gave the same answer. I wanted to go to my family in Israel because I knew them both. They had both visited the Netherlands, and I'd spent quite a bit of time with them. And each time I said I wanted to go to Israel, and so I was sent to Manchester. It was a dysfunctional family. You know, my cousin, the daughter of that family, may be watching this on Facebook. So, but I think she recognizes that fact. It's not controversial.
Nonetheless, I managed to get a very good education there.
A wonderful education. I mean, I ended up going to Manchester Grammar School and to Oxford University, to Brasenose College, and boy, am I grateful for that. That was.
And in that.
But I mean, before I went to Manchester Grammar School, I was sent to a boarding school in York. You know, I couldn't understand why I was sent to a boarding school when the family in Manchester was so keen to have me. Because in Dutch, the word for boarding school is the same as approved school, or, you know, if you're bad, we'll send you to boarding school. That's a standard threat made to little kids in the Netherlands. But there were exactly 6 Jewish boys in that school. And the reason I know is that they were bullied in an anti-Semitic way. I had grown up in the hands of a Christian family in the Netherlands, and in Amsterdam, I'd actually come home one day saying I wanted to be brought up as a Jew. And over dinner, the man of the family explained to me that if I did that, then when I died, it would mean I would spend eternity in hellfire. And so they brought me up as a Christian. You know, I considered myself a Christian at this boarding school in York. So I didn't get the bullying. But because I refused to join in, my classmates asked them, "Are you a Jew?" And to say that I was not stuck in my throat. And from then I was treated like the other Jewish boys.
So I
got myself removed from that school.
Some of the dilemmas that and challenges of integrity that you had been on the receiving end of, and the people who had saved you had put themselves into, you know, in your own way.
Yeah. The anti-Semitism didn't come from the school as an institution or from the teachers. It came from the boys.
Right.
They brought it from home. And of course, some of their fathers would have been in the British Army in Palestine. And, you know, some of their hatred of Jews might be understandable, given some of the things that happened.
Right. So jumping forwards, I mean, how has the commemoration of the Shoah changed since, the memories you have of growing up to what we have today?
Well, of course, for most of my life, there was essentially no commemoration. I mean, it still puzzles me that the family that looked after me in the Netherlands never really asked what happened to me after I was taken away and before I came back. And it wasn't, they didn't want to talk about the war. They talked about it all the time. And I could tell you an enormous amount about what happened to them during the war, a lot of which was horrific. They didn't go to concentration camps, but they went in very real and justified fear of their lives, both from arrest and all the consequences, and from starving to death in the final winter of the Second World War. But they talked about that tremendously, but they never asked me, and I still find that hard. But that was a pretty general reaction, and generally Holocaust survivors didn't start talking about their experiences until quite late in their lives. And this was called the Great Silence until people researched it and came to the conclusion that what it actually was the Great Deafness.
Wow, so as an attempt to address that deafness, and in a moment I'll ask about the lessons that we should be teaching, but there's been a huge amount of controversy about the idea of putting a memorial outside the Parliament building here in London.
Yes.
What's your feeling about that?
Well, the idea of putting a reminder, a memorial to what can happen to democracy when things go wrong, and putting it right next to the Mother of Parliaments, that seems to me such an incontrovertibly brilliant idea that it has to be done. I am not a supporter of the idea of inflating that concept with an educational center. I think there are places where that larger purpose could be served much better. The Imperial War Museum would be an obvious answer. I think the people who have tried to hop onto this concept and make more of it have in fact endangered the core and the essence of the concept. So that very briefly would be my view on the matter.
So you're separating between the need to have a statement of memorial on the one hand, and the education of memory and lessons learned in another, and both have their place and should be kept distinct. What are the lessons that should be taught?
That's a very important question because, I started off with my reference to this Hungarian comic writer whose name I've got a mental block for.
George Mikesh.
Yes, that's right, indeed. Quite right. A bit similar to Ephraim Kishon, whose wonderful account of preparing for Pesach in his book, My Family Right or Wrong, I strongly recommend. The education is based on history, and it is based sort of 95, 98% on history. And history, of course, is vital, but there is more. I mean, here we are, at least virtually, in a shul, which teaches about human behavior, things you should do and things you should not do. And we need to study in this context what it was about the determinants of human behavior that led to this catastrophe and others like them, and the horrors we've had recently of, in the British political system, a poisonous current of anti-Semitism gaining prominence. Why do people behave like that? And There, I think, is a whole other task. And personally, I want to revolutionize Holocaust education, because there is the sciences of psychology, sociology, and the other sciences concerned with human behavior have been revolutionized since the 1950s and have a lot to teach us. I tell school kids that the simple-minded theory about why these things happen is it was one man, it was Hitler. He made tens of millions behave in an atrocious way, and on other occasions it was Stalin, Mao Zedong, Pol Pot, etc. This simply does not wash. You know, people have looked at that in great detail, and these great dictators only become great because they are made into that and supported into that by a mass of others. We have to study the whole society. And the truth, I tell school kids, is worse. It's not that it was one monster who made this happen. The truth is it was people very much like you and me. And that is much more frightening. Now, why that happens, I think, is precisely because you and I are psychologically normal. We necessarily have mechanisms in our mind that can go wrong and do that. Just as you have a thyroid gland and a pancreas, and I hope they're working, and I hope you're not having to take thyroid tablets or insulin, they just work and you're well. But if they go wrong, oh boy. And the same is true for normal aspects of psychology. We need those things to be normal. We need them to survive. But under some circumstances, boy, do they cause trouble. And by understanding that better, I think we will get further. Instead of just saying never again and then finding it's again and again, we will make more progress.
If I get pancreatitis, God forbid, it's not contagious. But we're living in a sort of pandemic world.
Yes.
And the infection that was anti-Semitism and Nazism was something that was contagious and spread. I mean, the contemporary, the last elections and the Brexit period, and what you see internationally is seeing a whole resurgence of identity politics and nationalisms and racisms. You know, that's more than just a pancreas going wrong. What is it that's allowing society as a whole to become so sick? And are you worried by what we're seeing?
I'm extremely worried by what we're seeing. And of course, this event is being streamed on Facebook. So I should just use this slot to explain my visceral hatred of Facebook. I have one Facebook page which explains that I don't like Facebook. And for exactly that reason, that we get drawn into this whirlpool, which sucks us in to a more intensified version of the views we already hold. I'm just reading Dr. Johnson's account of his travels in Scotland and the Western Isles, and he talks about how since the Knox Reformation in Scotland, alternative views are excluded and people talk only to the like-minded. He was describing in the 18th century the same phenomenon as we have in the 21st. It's not all due to online media. It's a characteristic of the human race. There's a wonderful book by a guy called Schwartzman about culture and politics in the Middle East. It talks about tribal life and the tribal attitude. And in a tribe, you don't ask who's right and wrong. You support the fellow member of your tribe, irrespective. And it's a human characteristic. And there is this contagious aspect, which is what makes it dangerous. It makes societies explode. But we need to understand ourselves in order to understand other people. And we need to understand the other people in a different way from the way that has been the main custom. Not we need to understand others, including the perpetrators, not as caricatures, but as the very real human beings they are.
Understanding people as human and their flaws is necessary to be able to create healing after trauma and after conflict, and try to build some kind of a rehabilitation. How does one manage sort of building forwards and forging new relationships without forgiving the past and the perpetrators?
Well, of course, two of the commonest questions I get asked by school kids are, do I hate the Germans, and do I forgive the perpetrators? And I point out that my mother was German, non-Jew, who put her life on the line by marrying a Jew in 1938, leaving the country of her birth to do that. And actually on her deathbed, as she was dying from this infection in hospital, she was hounded by two Nazi officials who were pressurizing her to divorce my father, because Jews married to non-Jewish German women had some degree of protection. And she refused. And when Hamburg and Dresden were bombed, there were people like that under the bombs, as well as people on leave from committing horrors in Auschwitz. So I tried to put across the message of, insofar as we judge people, we judge them according to what they do, not according to what they are by origin. Don't repeat the mistakes of our persecutors. And the worst thing a persecutor can do is to make you like him or herself. And then there's this question of forgiveness. And I try and explain to children that this is more complicated than it looks on the surface. I mean, there is, of course, the prayer before the bedtime Shema, which I find a very tough, very, very tough prayer, because it doesn't allow any escape. Forgiving everybody, whether they've done one kind of wrong thing or another kind of wrong thing. I find that difficult. But there it is. I mean, that's part of our religion. I mean, by the way, after the introductory story, I should just, before we leave this event, say that after I was moved to my Jewish family in Manchester, where I was sort of treated, what were these two Christian children doing in this nice Jewish family? That was the reaction of my uncle. But I joined in the festival observance insofar as it took place. I mean, it was a sort of mixed observance household. But in my 50s, I sheepishly walked up the steps of the shul in Leicester. And I didn't have a kippah, and I didn't know how to behave, and I'd forgotten what Hebrew I'd learned. I had learned some. And I sat in the furthest corner of the shul, where I still sit, when the shul is open. And I've been going ever since the early 1980s. And although technically, halachically, I'm not a Jew because my mother was not Jewish, in the meantime, I had married a non-Jewish woman, and it was explained to me by the Reverend Meyer Fine, who was the minister of the congregation at the time, that this made it impossible for me to convert, which is what I wanted to do. So that's my situation. Halachically, I'm not Jewish, but my religion is the Jewish religion, and I go to the Orthodox shul and not to the other one. It's a bit like the Jew who was stranded on the desert island and built a shul that he wouldn't be seen dead in. But forgiveness. I ask kids, what would you think if somebody murdered your mother and I forgave him? You might think I was an idiot, or that it was not my place to do that. On the other hand, I'm talking now about a religious issue the presence of somebody who should be my teacher. And I'm sure you know, all of you know all the considerations that come into it, that this is a heart-wrenching and deeply difficult but very important area.
Right. So we'll get it back into your area. Number one, you went into medicine. You know, how has your experiences shaped your views on the sanctity of life?
Well, of course, you know, the majority of my friends are proud atheists and believe that an intelligent, educated human being can decide what is right and wrong by their intelligence and their education. And by walking sheepishly up the steps of the shul, I was making a statement which was emphatically the opposite. And the majority of my friends, of course, believe in what they call euthanasia. Etymologically, euthanasia means a good death. And it seems to me highly debatable whether being killed by a doctor because you prefer that to the alternative is actually a good death. Look, there are occasions when I have, as a doctor, given pain-relieving treatment to a dying patient in severe pain, knowing that the pain-relieving treatment would kill them, or expecting that it would. It's not always successful, actually, as it turns out. And even well-educated doctors get it wrong, as I have done on occasion. You know, there's the question of being reasonably humane, but this was only in patients in whom death was the only possible outcome within a pretty short time. And suffering, I would certainly not be happy to tolerate myself being the alternative. When people have asked me, or relatives or friends have talked to me about this subject, I'm totally opposed to it. It's not our place. And, you know, there is a whole discipline within medicine. The hospice movement is prominent in it. You can assure a patient that you can't necessarily save their life, but you can save them from pain, and you can save them from unacceptable suffering. And I'm on the side of the people who support that.
So it's commitment to dignity in life.
Yes, the sanctity of life. Look, if society passes a law making it legal to do what the Dignitas clinic in Switzerland does, then appoint killers. Mm-hmm. I'm a doctor, not a killer. You know, if I go up to a patient's bedside, I don't want there to be any equivocation about why I'm at the patient's bedside. Right. And, you know, I've had this with a Dutch relative who was diabetic. His foot had been needed amputating, and he was in a bad way. And the Dutch doctors were proposing that he should have, you know, be killed by a doctor. And I argued against it. And was successful. And that guy had 2 further years of life, which, despite severe disability, he enjoyed. He was able to laugh, he was able to converse, he was able to interact with his children and his wife. And then he died for unavoidable reasons. And his wife died shortly afterwards, as often happens when with a couple that are attached to each other. That's my position.
Right.
It's different from the Dutch legal position.
And just another area where, you know, your experiences give you a measure of expertise. I mean, we are spending time in isolation.
Yes.
That you know, is unfamiliar to us.
Yes.
But being trapped inside is something that, you know, you've experienced through incomparable adversity. But are there lessons on resilience from your experiences that you think you could share?
It's difficult. I mean, I'm of course intensely concerned with my fellow Holocaust survivors who are predominantly older and sometimes quite considerably older than myself. And we phone each other a lot. We have set up a Zoom group. We're sort of learning to get to grips with that. For older people particularly, this social distancing is going to last a long time. And, you know, I'm really thinking in terms of between 1 and 2 years, and it may be longer because we don't know what the success will be with vaccines yet. And the mental state of traumatized people, and Holocaust survivors are not the only traumatized people. You know, society contains other people who have suffered terrible things. There may be people on my screen at the moment who have suffered terrible trauma. And when you are in difficult circumstances, you are denied social contact. You have to look after your mental health very carefully. I mean, I once had a chat with about depression, which I think is universal amongst Holocaust survivors, even if they deny it. You know, if you talk to a Holocaust survivor who's been successful in life, you know, they're famous and they live in a nice house, and you know, they've got a wife and a large family, and everything seems to have gone right for them. And you start talking with them about depression, they are awfully knowledgeable.
Mm-hmm.
You know, they're lying if they say they don't know what depression is. So this, you know, social distancing is traumatic. I believe depression is a social disease. I think it is based. I went to see Hugo Grin, because a professor of medicine who was a friend, you know, suggested I should go and see him. And he was already ill, which I didn't realize. And I mean, he was surrounded by a swarm of people like flies who were demanding his attention. And it was this guy he didn't know who wanted to have a chat with him, coming unannounced. But he did sit down and we had a short chat. And one of the few things he said to me is the medical profession is pretty bad at dealing with depression, isn't it? And of course, in my clinic, I was treating people with asthma and allergy. I'm not a psychiatrist, but inevitably, some of my patients suffered from potentially suicidal depression. So it was my duty to send them to a psychiatrist. And I chose one who I thought was a good one. Son of a Holocaust survivor, as I later found out. And when they came back to me for their allergy or asthma, I asked them, you know, this time with the psychiatrist, did it do any good? I don't think a single one said yes. So I don't think I agree with Hugo Grin that the medical profession is not terribly good at it. And I think the key to depression, or its opposite, lack of depression, is social interaction. So maintaining social contact with each other during this time of social distancing is something we can do for each other, whether traumatized by the Holocaust or something else, or not traumatized by exceptional events. This is a very important part of our duty.
Thank you. So in 2018, you received an MBE for your services to Holocaust education. And you got that from Her Majesty the Queen. We do need to take a moment to wish the Queen, God bless her, a very happy birthday today. And just how was how was it for you to spend that time with her and to have that recognition?
Well, I'm not. I mean, I've become an admirer of the Queen over the years. I used to be quite, dismissive and Republican about that, but to an extent. But there I was. There were 60 people getting various honours at Buckingham Palace, and I was sort of 2 or 3 from the end. I was nearly last. So here was this 91-year-old lady standing on her feet for an hour, because it, on average, takes 1 minute per person. And you have to go through this kind of, you're drilled in exactly how to walk, and you turn through a right angle and you face the Queen, you take a few steps toward her and stand in an exact spot, etc., etc. And then afterwards you walk backwards, and all this sort of choreography, which takes up a part of the time. And then the Queen speaks first, so I believe you do Holocaust education. And you get, the small part of the minutes can be devoted to the conversation. And I said, I'm trying to teach young people to think more deeply about why the human race does this to itself from time to time. And I mean, this poor woman had been standing there. I mean, I was nearly the last one, and she'd been giving honours to people responsible for the public drains in Northern Ireland and goodness knows what, I wasn't expecting anything. But, I mean, the flash in her eye, and I can't remember the exact words, but it was clear that this was something that mattered to her. She had thought about it, she had a view, and I went out reminded that this is a woman who has had weekly meetings with prime ministers since the early 1950s, and they take her very seriously. I went out a changed man as far as that is concerned.
So that's
I was struck.
Positive way to bring our conversation to a close this morning, now this afternoon, Martin. Thank you very much for joining us, and at very short notice, giving us so much of your time on a very important landmark day in the calendar. It's been fascinating listening to you and being able to listen to your experiences. And as you say, every survivor is an exception.
Yes.
And that theory is the exception. You're parts of your story which are completely new to me. I know some of the faces I see on the screens around, everybody has their own story and their own connections. Yeah. But it's been a privilege to listen to you, and I thank you for making that possible. I wish you and all your family only good health into the future, and may we continue to be able to listen to the wisdom and insights of the survivors. And may their memory and the memories they carry with of those who are lost continue to remind us of how we should live our lives and how we should treat people with respect. So thank you very much all. But I've got a question from Deborah Clemens, who says, how do you explain the emergence of your faith, not only to your atheist colleagues, but also to those who lost faith under the circumstances?
Yeah. Well, I found myself surrounded in daily life as a working doctor and, doing the ordinary sort of things by a lot of people who were not expressing any religion, but they thought what was right, they knew what was right and wrong. And in fact, they used to get on a high moral horse about it. And of course, in scientific medicine, a subject that's incredibly important is statistics. A lot of the, when we evaluate a treatment, you have to be sure that the benefit that you're observing is not merely the result of chance. And I noticed that in 100% of cases, this advice coming or argument coming from the person on their high moral horse ended up in their material advantage. And I'm not a great believer in human infallibility. I thought this was statistically unlikely to be the correct position, that morality should always end up with an answer which left the speaker better off. I was a skeptic about that, and I didn't think I was any better than the others. And so I decided that a human being needs to refer to a standard of morality external to him or herself. So you can choose. There are various ones around, but Judaism has been around for a very long time. It seems to work. And what's more, some very nasty people wanted to stamp it out. I decided to choose the Jewish religion for that. Since then, of course, I've been studying psychology.
Right.
And I didn't realize at that time how right I was. There is something called cognitive bias. You know, every judgment we make is made with a twist, which works in our own favor. Most people who drive think they are better than average drivers.
Mm-hmm.
People in London were questioned to ask how nice they were compared to the average person. 98% thought they were nicer than average. Now, this tells you a few things. First of all, it's mathematically pretty well impossible. It also tells you that we judge other people to be less nice than ourselves. That interlinks with a lot of observations in psychology, which I haven't got time to go into. But there's another question. What about the 2%? Mm-hmm. Who didn't give that answer? And I asked that question to a large room full of doctors about a year ago. And answer came there, none. These were orthopedic surgeons. But there was one person sitting in the front row who was a professional psychologist, and I turned the question to her, and she gave the right answer. These people are predominantly the depressed. Depressed people think more negatively about themselves than the rest of us. And it's not good to be depressed. There is a small risk of suicide. About 5% of people who have severe depression. But even depressed people who don't commit suicide, it's an incredibly disabling condition. You can't do your job properly if you're severely depressed. You don't function well in your duties in everyday life. Depression is a bad idea, and I don't recommend it. So, you know, whereas we are brought up with the prejudice that it's best to be objective, to have a realistic view of the outside world, in fact, it turns out to have survival value to be prejudiced in your own favor. You see, we all encounter things going wrong. You build a garden shed and the wind blows it down. You write an essay and somebody tells you it's not very good, really. Your parents die, or God forbid your child, you know. We all encounter misfortunes in life, and people disapprove of us, and sometimes these things come in groups. And it's very easy to become depressed. And it seems that it's only by having a positive, sunny outlook, which is to some extent false, that it helps us to overcome adversity. But I have a teaching tool which I use. Yes, I'll show it to you. I'll show it to you. Balance.
Mm-hmm.
You can have too much, and then you become a persecutor of other people around you. You're demanding an unfair share of what the world has to offer. You can have too little, and then you can be tipped into unproductive and dangerous depression. Balance. So, you know, a prejudice in our own favor, it turns out to be, in the view of scientific psychologists, a necessary psychological characteristic for our survival. But we have to get it right. So, I didn't realize in the early 1980s that there was a bunch of science backing this up. And by the way, people talk about an argument between science and religion. You know, they watch television, so they know how the universe was created. And of course, it wasn't some old man waving a magic wand and doing it all in 7 days. They know all the answers, except they don't. Because not even physicists understand how quantum physics works. Not even physicists know what was there before the Big Bang.
Right. We need a God
people
somewhere.
Yeah, I mean, the people who think they understand everything are living with a delusion. Most of our beliefs, as it turns out, are delusions. This is normal. But here is this whole science of human behavior, which tells us that objectiveness is not the ideal state. We need a bias in our own favor to survive, but we also have to live with other people. And so we need an external reference point. And, you know, here is the religion, which is that external reference point. I didn't realize in the 1980s how I was right in terms of science, you know, never mind morality. And the people who argue about a dichotomy between science and religion, they are choosing bits of science they actually don't understand and ignoring bits of science that provide an answer they don't like.
Let me double check.
They are themselves deluded.
How do you leave?
Very interesting. All right. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you for your time. I'm going to have to close down this meeting because I'm...
Thank you very much again. Thank you.
Well, lovely to meet you all.
Thanks very much, Martin.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'll thank all of you for
And
putting...
keep safe. And don't catch the nasty virus.
Indeed.
Thanks very much.
Thanks all.